So in this video, we're going to take this flat piece of sheet metal and turn it into this. So what's a cab brace? So in 69 through 72 GM trucks, when you ordered the sport bucket seat package option, you also got this additional cab brace welded into the floor support. So this goes in this location, spans across the mounting points of the bucket seats, and is welded to the bottom of the floor. So now that you know what it is, let's talk about how to make it. So here's a look at the cab brace in a little more detail. And it's made up really of two shapes. So the first shape, kind of the most recognizable, is this shape that you see here as you're looking at it through this view. But what makes this part a little more complex is that it also has shape in this view. So you'll notice this plane is at a different height than this plane. So this part actually has this transition region here in the transmission tunnel area that we have to recreate as well. So in terms of making a part of this complexity, it's really about breaking it down into small, manageable chunks. So in this case, we start with just some 2D profile templates. So this first template is going to recreate that end geometry. And we have a second template that's going to be used to create this transition area. And then it's just a straight shot in between and then the mirror image on the other side. So we're going to use these templates to create a hammer forming die. And hammer forming involves taking two dies and clamping them together, sandwiching your sheet metal in between. That's going to create one shape. Sometimes that's flat. In the case of this part, it's actually going to have a little transition region. And then we're going to hammer in the secondary shape to that hammer form. So in this case, we're going to hammer up this flange and down this flange when it's clamped in our die set. So let's take a look at that die set. So here's one piece of the die. And this is constructed of steel. Since this material is 16 gauge, that's quite a bit to hammer form, so you need a substantial die. Also, I plan to make many of these parts, so I wanted a nice robust die. But you may look at this and say, wow, that's really complex. How do you make that shape? Again, just break it down into the smaller chunks. So here is template number 1. Here is template number 2. And then the way this was constructed was just in sections. So if I flip this die set over, you're going to see we've got a section joined by a straight piece of bar stock, two weld joints here. We've got that other transition region, another piece of bar stock, and then the mirror image version of that. Now this die set also has that first shape, which again, easily recognizable here, but then it also has that transition zone as well. So again, this plane transitions down to this plane, and again, the mirror image on this side. Now for a hammer form, you need two sets of this. So you need this die and then its mirror image. So again, this die here, constructed using the same methods. And now we have the mirror image of the die set up above. So when we put our piece of sheet metal in between these two dies and clamp them together, that's going to create the first shape, and we're going to hold that fixed to where it doesn't move, and then we're going to hammer in the two flanges that you see here on the actual part. So now that we know a little bit more about the brace, the die set, let's talk about the tools we're going to use to make this. So for hammer forming, we need a hammer. And in this case, flat face, round face, auto body, doesn't matter. Any hammer will do. However, for the part that we're making today, that's 16 gauge steel, and it would take me about 300 years to make that part using traditional hammers. So we're going to step our game up a little bit, and we're going to use an aircraft rivet gun. So on the working end of this rivet gun is a cup that accepts various inserts. In this case, this is a Delrin insert, great for impact resistance, leaves behind a nice smooth finish, and we'll be using this for 90% of the work we do today. Now, some zones are going to require all of that power to be transferred into the part, and we're going to do that with an aluminum insert that you see here. Only drawback to using that is it does leave behind some hammer marks, but I'll show you how to get rid of those a little bit later. On the other end of this rivet gun is basically our throttle pedal, and we can operate this from just a few hammer shots per second to machine gun mode and anywhere in between. So now we know the tools, we've got a die, let's make a part. So now I'm loading in the sheet metal blank, and again that's 16 gauge sheet metal that we're using here. And those two bolts on either end, those are used to align the dies together, and then they also served as the primary clamping mechanism between the two die sets. And you can see here I'm just taking my time making sure to get things aligned so that the flanges are even all the way on either side of the part. And it does take a little bit of time to develop that blank. I think probably on Rev 12 right now. And so far it's been pretty good, pretty stable in terms of not leaving too much material to trim off of the ends, as you only want to form just a little bit more than you need, not a whole bunch more. So it's taking a little bit of time to get that particular shape dialed in. And then in addition to the bolts, you're also seeing here a lot of C-clamps that are also used to clamp the part in the middle. And you do have to work around those as you're forming, but it helps make sure things are compressed well in terms of keeping everything sandwiched together while you're doing the hammer forming process. It looks like I'm looking for a nut there. There we go, found it. So then we'll just tighten up the rest of the C-clamps here and kind of gradually lower things in place. Now remember, this particular shape that we're putting into the part, just in clamping it, that is important. So that will establish that first shape. Again, those planes, different planes on the formed sections that I showed you earlier. So by squeezing things together like this, we slowly establish that first shape, and then just tightening down the bolts on the end just to square everything up and compress the ends. Now I also use just a little bit of lubricant, in this case WD-40. It's just going to help with this hammer form tool kind of glide along the sheet metal. You don't need a lot. You also notice when I start shaping here, I'm actually shaping on the opposite side first, and the reason I do that is to kind of lock in that blank piece of sheet metal. I've had trouble before if I just go in right as you see now and start forming, that it will actually pull that material from the other side through the die and make this flange actually longer than it needs to be, and make the other flange shorter than it needs to be. So by coming in and just hitting that first section there on the edges of the form, again on the opposite side that I'm forming now, kind of just locks in and prevents this operation from pulling any sheet metal through the die set onto the other side. And basically all I'm going to do here is just use this tool to work the sheet metal down from right to left in this view. And you'll notice I'm not going fully around or fully forming right off the bat. So just kind of easing this down a little at a time. I'll probably make about 3 passes here. And again, just easing the sheet metal down. And what you start to realize here is that shrinking and stretching phenomenon coming into place around these curved sections. So the inside radiuses are going to be stretched, and those are pretty easy to form, basically just thinning out the material and mash it into place. But the challenging areas are going to be the shrink zone, so those are going to be at the outside corner areas. And on this side of the die, I've got 4 of those shrink zones and only 2 stretch zones. I don't really count this little one here, it's pretty small. But we'll make 1 pass here, and this kind of finishes up the first pass on this side, and all the forming to this point has been done with that Delrin insert. And since things vibrate quite a bit whenever I'm doing this, you have to kind of readjust your C-clamps and tighten them back up along the way. But now we'll get going on the second pass, and again we're forming that down a little bit further each time, and just kind of walking this down little by little until we get it essentially hammered flat to the die set. And here you can see one of those stretch zones, and again the material kind of really easily just wants to go into that corner. We're stretching it thinner than its base material. And then as we get into this corner here, this is going to be a shrink zone, and effectively there's an excess of material at that outside corner. And again, there would be another one here as well on that outside corner. And that's where the challenge comes in with forming, is you got an excess of material and you just have to hammer and hammer and hammer away at those spots in order to force the material to comply with the die set in that location. And these flat sections here are pretty easy. Just sort of straight bending that flange over, and again the curves are where things get a little more challenging. And you can see those puckers or shrink zones start to form up there. Again, that excess of material. And now we're on to pass number 3, and this is where we'll start to put that final form on the part itself. And then now you start to see me transition over to the aluminum insert in this shrinking zone. And that's really needed because there's just a lot of material to push into place around that corner. And that Delrin insert just absorbs too much of the impact load from the rivet gun at that point. So the aluminum is a lot firmer, transfers that hit a lot better into the material. And then you do have to deal with some hammer marks in that zone. But since we have an excess of material, it's really easy just to sand that back off. And I'll show you that process a little bit later. But yeah, just slowly working that section down. And I didn't mention earlier, this is running about 2.5 times speed. So it's really zipping around here. I don't quite move that fast, just to kind of speed things up for you guys watching. And then the flat sections here kind of form really nicely there. Again, back to that Delrin insert. And kind of using this just like a planishing hammer, moving things around. Now this is a close-up view of that stretch zone that you see here. I'm kind of working that corner in, and you can start to see that flange just kind of rotate around that corner. and then just using that Delrin insert to just planish everything nice and smooth. Yep, and then just wiping the WD-40 away to show that flange. Now when you get into these shrink zones, it's important to kind of lock in where you're going to be forming that shrink area. So that pucker or that tuck, now we'll start to work on that, given that I've formed the areas around it flat. So basically the material has nowhere to go other than to be hammered into that particular corner. Now you have to be a little bit careful here in terms of that section, at least on this particular form, just to not overly get aggressive and actually fold the material over. So we're trying to keep it all consistent thickness wise and not end up with some overlaps in that zone. So you kind of have to take your time and not be too aggressive in terms of hammering that flat. Kind of let the material flow in and thicken up as it needs to in that particular zone. And I'm just swapping back and forth here between the soft and the hard insert here, just planishing that area down smooth. And again, on this one, that heavy shrink zone in that corner there is just a big stretch, so no problems in that spot. And just pushing down the material on either side of that shrink zone to lock in those tucks. And you can see there as well, there's some debris that pops off of that plastic insert as it's forming, and effectively I just resurface them after each cab brace that I make. So just freshen up that surface on the plastic insert. And now I'm going at this one with the aluminum insert, and you see kind of pushing that shrink zone around, and it's not quite locked in as it's starting to push out in different areas, but that's okay. Again, we're just trying to work this down nice and smooth. Don't be too aggressive to where you end up with folds. But you can see on that particular zone it was just locked in and had nowhere else to go but to shrink and flatten out. And then now just kind of planishing everything out, getting rid of some of those smaller wrinkles. And then back to the plastic insert. Yeah, and then just waving over the part here, nice and smooth. And I don't get too concerned about that kind of wrinkled area at the bottom edge of that. We'll be trimming that off later. Yeah, here's the finished area, and that'll just sand up really smooth, as you'll see in the later segments. And then just continuing on, again, this is our third and final pass, and just pushing everything all the way down flat against the other die. You can see in this straight section, really easy to just push that down. And this also gives you a good visual on that 2D shape that we pushed into the part just by clamping it between the two dies. And then just finishing up kind of that last section here. And those zones still have some shrink, but not as aggressive as the other corners that we did earlier. Again, it's not quite the same angle, so it's not as challenging to make the materials shrink into that zone. Just kind of going back over the part, cleaning up any areas that need to be addressed, and now we can remove the clamps. And this side is formed, again flush with the die. And now we'll heave this over. It's kind of heavy, both dies together. Now we'll flip it over to the other side. And then these little brackets here are just used to hold the die set in place to keep it from walking all over my table here. So just kind of lock that in. When it's in the other orientation, it actually hooks over the edge of the table, but this zone or this side, you can't do that. And then same process here, we'll repeat on this side. So just getting everything C-clamped together. And in this case, I'll just be using 4 of the clamps instead of 5. I can't quite reach to get a clamp on that center section, so I just use 4 instead. And then away we go. So same process here. You know, that corner that I just went through, that's an easy stretch zone. And then come up on the next corner here to the left of where I'm at, and that's another one of those shrink zones. And similar to the other side, just kind of walking this down little by little. So we'll make probably 3 passes here just to get it fully formed. And then this section here, that's a stretch zone, so really easy to form, and your material just easy to just stretch into those corners. And again, this is a shrink zone. That outside corner, always going to have a shrink spot there. Again, an excess of material that you got to deal with. So this side usually takes probably about 60% of the time as the other side, just given that you've only got 2 real heavy shrink zones to work with. So just a little bit faster forming on this side. And if you kind of already got things figured out at this point, feel free to jump ahead on the video to the finishing sessions. But yeah, this center section here just forms really easily. I mean, it's just a matter of just pushing the material into those corners. And again, starting to develop those tucks or puckers in that shrink zone on that outside corner. And then an easy stretch spot on that inside corner that you see here. I didn't mention earlier, I'm letting this tool do the work. So I'm just kind of holding on and steering and pointing at where I want it to go, and then just relying on the strength of the rivet gun to actually do the forming here. So you don't have to manhandle the tool to make it move this material. It hits plenty hard, so you just have to get it in alignment. And just rolling that ribbon of material around the form. So like I said, this side is just a lot easier. Once you've got the other side conquered, this is pretty simple. And I've probably made 50 plus of these cab braces on this die set, so I've spent some time forming things on it. So it's kind of old hat to me in terms of using it, but it certainly took a while to develop the technique, and like I mentioned earlier, the die set, of course the die set and the blank that goes into the into the tool as well. And I would just say, if you're going to take this on, certainly just stick to it. Right? You get some of those big pucker or shrink zones, and it gets challenging. Maybe it doesn't turn out quite nice the first time you do it. Just keep at it. This type of process will net good parts. It just may take you a few times and a little bit of practice to get it to turn out like you want. So now everything's formed, and just a matter of taking the part out between the dies. So I'm just knocking the bolts out of either side here. And then this is the best part, taking it out of the die. There you go. This is the majority of the work in terms of forming the part. And in the next few stages, we'll trim and sand and smooth and polish, and really make it look nice. And then this is the benefit of using that hammer form. In my case, I've made a lot of these, and you can make parts one after another. They're all consistent. They're all the same shape. And that's the beauty of the hammer forming process. So now this blank does have a little bit of excess on either side. So this particular tool here just used to keep a consistent flange dimension. So it's around 1 inch flange on either side. So I just put a Sharpie inside of that cylindrical chunk of wood, run that along the edge, describe a nice line that will bandsaw off here shortly. And then the ends, just kind of freehand those. And then onto the bandsaw, and I just use this small kind of portable setup from Swag Off-Road. And there's just enough room here to slide that little sliver all the way along the length of the part, but I'll usually trim it off a little shorter as I go along. But yeah, just kind of normal bandsaw work here, trimming the edge, and that'll take care of a lot of those wrinkled sections that are in those shrink zones. So we'll effectively just trim them off. And then of course, sanding everything smooth right up to that line. And I just use a belt sander for that. And then you do end up with quite a nasty burr on the edge of the part from the bandsaw and the sander. So I just kind of work that down with a file to get rid of the heavy stuff, and then this little dual-sided deburring tool that cuts either side or both sides of the flange. And you're just kind of feeling there just to make sure that I don't have any burrs popping up. Make sure that edge is nice and smooth. Now, in those heavy shrink zones, there are some hammer marks from that aluminum tool. And really, all you have to do in those areas, since the material is just a little bit thicker than the base material, now that we've shrunk it into those corners, is effectively just sand off those hammer marks. And in most cases, I can get them out pretty easily with just a 3M maroon Scotch-Brite pad, as you see here. Just kind of smoothing those areas out and getting rid of all those little kind of micro dimples left behind from the aluminum insert. And then same thing with a maroon pad here, just polishing it up a little bit, orienting the grain of the sanding with the part. Just makes it look a little nicer in the end. So again, hitting the other two shrink zones on this side of the part. So this was side one that we worked now. And then just use that little round drum on a die grinder to kind of smooth everything out, make it look nice and finished. And then we'll flip over the part, and on this side of the part, so this is side 2, there are just 2 of those shrink zones that we have to deal with. So same process here, just hit them with a medium Scotch-Brite pad, and then we'll just run that Scotch-Brite drum over them after we get things smoothed out. Now there are some spots that still need a little bit more attention. Maybe it needs to be just smoothed out just a little bit, and I just use a hammer and dolly to correct some low spots here. And you can see here, just feeling, observing the part, just seeing where it might need just a little bit more help, a little bit more finishing. And in reality, this is a brace that goes underneath of the cab. This is not like you're sculpting a fender, so you don't have to be quite as precise on getting things super smooth. But I do sell these parts and like to give the customer a good finished look on things, even if it's not going to be seen, even if it's going to be buried under the truck or undercoated or bedlined, to kind of resolve all of those little surface imperfections. I do work to get it as smooth as I can, even though it is just a brace that gets welded in underneath the cab. Always like to keep the quality up here. And then just some final hand scuffing here just to get everything smooth and finished. And then the last part of the process is forming the last flange, and this will be how it gets welded into the cab. This flange here will be what's locating between 2 of the primary cross members in the cab. So this operation is just done by hand, and I do have this little fixture here that helps make sure everything's nice and consistent. I'm just making sure things are even on both sides here, but this will set that final width and lock in that distance to what it needs to be per the truck cab. And then just hammering that over by hand to make that last bend. And then that fixture just makes sure, again, all parts are the same. Everyone is bent to that same dimension. Yeah, and there it is, all finished up. Just doing a final inspection. So that's how you make a cab brace. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Old Truck Fan, signing off.